The late summer sun burned high over the Texas plains as a rickety army truck rumbled toward a modest ranch on the outskirts of Abilene. In the back, Liselot Über, a young woman of 22 from Munich, clutched the edges of the bench. She had been conscripted as a clerk for the German war effort, never firing a shot, never touching a weapon, yet here she was prisoner of war. She wore a faded gray uniform, no insignia, carrying nothing but her small bundle of personal items. The warnings had been drilled into her since capture. America is cruel. Americans are monsters. You will be humiliated, starved, beaten. Every kind gesture is a trap. But as the truck crested a low rise, Liselot froze. The scene before her eyes was nothing like the horrors she had been taught to expect. There was no barbed wire, no armed guards pacing in rigid lines. Instead, a row of horses stood lazily under the sun, their manes glinting gold. The field stretched wide, endless, dotted with cedar posts and wildflowers bending gently in the breeze. At the gate, a man in a straw hat leaned against the fence, arms crossed, observing without hostility, just quiet, calm presence. His gaze unflinching and patient, unsettled Liselot more than fear ever had. The truck halted with a soft lurch. The doors opened. Liselot stepped onto the reddish dirt, her boots sinking slightly. The air was thick with the scent of livestock, mesquite, and sun-warmed earth. She expected the metallic clang of a prison gate to strike harshly in her ears, but the gate closed with a gentle click. Her heart raced not from fear, but from a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. Inside the camp, everything defied expectation. Barracks were wooden, and long, clean windows open to the sun. White curtains fluttered, and laundry lines swayed gently in the wind, displaying uniforms and modest civilian clothes. There were fans, mattresses, running water. No cages, no chains. Even the soldiers escorting her seemed more routine than threatening, faces impassive. Rather than angry, at registration she received a small canvas sack, extra sets of clothes, a towel, a toothbrush, a bar of soap. A nurse asked in accented German if she had any injuries. Liselot shook her head, uncertain whether she could trust this. Reality. Bunk 23, Barrack 6. The neighbor was a sunburned girl from Hamburg, sleeves patched and hand-mended with a dry smile. "It's not what they told us, is it?" she whispered. Liselot only blinked, the world turning soft and strange around her. Dinner was beans, cornbread, sweet tea, foods she had never tasted yet, somehow comforting. Orientation followed. A captain read aloud, voice official and detached. Geneva Convention. Protections, work assignments, pay stored for the camp store, no unauthorized contact with civilians, and the option of voluntary English classes in the evenings. Liselot nearly laughed aloud. Voluntary English classes for prisoners. Could it really be true? Night fell with a chorus of cicadas outside the window. Liselot lay on the bunk, whispering to herself in German. If this is the enemy, then what else did they lie about? She could hardly reconcile the horrors she had been told with the quiet calm and order of Camp Darnell. There were rules, yes, but no cruelty, only routine, only a strange, persistent sense of normalcy that seemed almost impossible. 3 nights later, she attended her first English lesson. Miss Turner, the teacher, was a retired schoolteacher from Sweetwater, short and round, glasses sliding down her nose. "English is not about perfection," she said, voice gentle. "It's about connection." Liselot repeated the alphabet, stumbled over hard consonants, twisted her tongue around unfamiliar vowels, and tried American RS that felt unnatural. "Other girls," muttered, smirked, whispered. "They want to turn us into them." But Liselot focused on the teacher's mouth, the rhythm, the sounds, chair, table, window. Slowly words began to feel solid, tangible. Poetry arrived next, simple lines by Carl Sandburg. "The fog comes on little calf feet." Liselot read it in the dim light of her bunk, imagining fog creeping across Bavarian hills, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she laughed quietly. Not loudly, not from joy, but from disbelief, an acknowledgement of life still persisting beyond war, fear, and loss. The next morning, stable assignments awaited. Horses again, and with them James Callahan. Silent, steady, calm. He handed her a brush, nodded, and returned to his work. She sneezed from the dust. He chuckled and said, pointing at the hay, Too much horse. Not funny, not mocking, but somehow like human, a bridge across language and culture. By day's end, Liselot was caught between worlds. A land taught to be hated had shown her kindness. A man she was supposed to. Fear now embodied it. Her thoughts twisted with questions, curiosity, and the faintest stirrings of hope. The dusty Texas sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the camp gold, as if the earth itself promised something beyond the gray uniform and the distant war. And in that golden twilight, Liselot Über, German clerk, POW and prisoner of expectation, took her first steps toward a life she never imagined, one of language learning and unknowingly love. The mornings at Camp Darnell began with a soft light stretching over the plains, the air still cool, smelling of dew and hay. For Liselot, each dawn was a reminder that this place, so unlike anything she had imagined in America, was real. The guards called the roll, the barracks creaked with early movement, and the distant neighing of horses punctuated the routine. Here nothing seemed designed to terrify, yet every day carried an invisible weight. She was a prisoner, yes, but not one in chains. A strange duality governed her existence, freedom contained within invisible rules. Her first week passed in a blur of chores and observation. The stables were her domain, and the horses, majestic, unpredictable living creatures, became her teachers. James Callahan appeared each day, a constant in her new foreign life. At first their communication was minimal. Words were exchanged sparingly, slow and deliberate. Brush, Zan, saddle, saddle, step by step, object by object. Liselot absorbed more English than she had thought possible, and she realized slowly that she was learning far more than language. She was learning the rhythms of a land untouched by total war, a life unhurried, governed by patience rather than fear. Miss Turner's evening classes became the other cornerstone of her adjustment. At first Liselot sat quietly, unsure of herself, tongue tied around the strange consonants and vowels. Each lesson, however, was a small triumph. Words were not simply uttered, they were felt, connected to objects, gestures, the world around her, chair, table, door, window, freedom. The word felt like a distant star she had been told never to approach, now faintly glowing within reach. Every word carried possibility. Every lesson chipped away at the mental chains of propaganda drilled into her since childhood. She began whispering English words to herself as she worked in the stables, imagining them creeping into her mouth like sunlight over hills. The calm, the shadows of the war lingered. Letters from home were rare, often delayed for months, and when they arrived they carried both relief and devastation. One such letter from her mother detailed the bombing of their Munich apartment. Liselot's father had perished, neighbors pulled from rubble, and her younger brother Jakob was missing. Grief came not with tears, but as a deep, silent ache, one that pressed against her chest and rendered words useless. Yet the camp offered something, even in sorrow, a space to process, to breathe, and perhaps to survive. Social dynamics among the prisoners were as complex as the camp itself. Girls whispered, shared grudges, exchanged rumors about the Americans, about fraternization, about those who dared to smile too widely at a civilian. Liselot listened, careful, aware of eyes watching her every movement. The rules were clear: no contact, no friendship, no emotional attachments. Yet small moments, shared laughter over a horse's stubborn behavior, a look exchanged across a fence line, the cautious passing of water from one hand to another, were impossible to suppress. They carried weight, a subtle rebellion against the invisible walls that had been erected around them. James remained enigmatic. He worked quietly, patient and precise with the horse's offering. Minimal guidance but maximum respect. Liselot watched him handle each animal with reverence, understanding that strength need not be loud, nor kindness weak. She mirrored his movements, learning to anticipate the horse's reactions, to move in tandem with the rhythms of its body. Each day the bond grew, not declared, not named, but unmistakable, a silent understanding bridging language, culture, and the divide of war. The camp itself was not without its tensions. Guards observed, some with suspicion, some indifferent. Yet even the wary soldiers could not suppress the quiet humanity of the place. The barracks were orderly, the meals Repetitive but nourishing, the work demanding but never cruel. The girls learned to navigate their surroundings with caution and ingenuity. They developed routines, waking early, preparing for chores, participating in classes, and sharing small clandestine joys in the evenings. Every act of normalcy was an act of defiance against the horrors that had driven them. Here language in particular became a portal. English lessons introduced new worlds of thought, humor, and expression. Miss Turner emphasized connection over correctness, teaching poems, simple songs, and idioms. Liselot found herself reading lines aloud late at night, repeating them until they felt familiar. Carl Sandburg's "The fog comes on little cat feet" became a secret mantra, a way to imagine peace creeping softly into a shattered world. Words, she realized, could heal as much as they could alienate. Yet reality intruded. The camp's fraternization policy was clear, a constant undercurrent, threatening to undo every fragile connection. One afternoon, a corporal with a scar across his nose lingered near the stable. Eyes sharp, calculating, rumors spread like wildfire. Unsanctioned contact would be punished severely. Liselot felt the weight of each glance, each whisper. A girl named Hira cornered her in the laundry room, dark hair falling across her face, chipped tooth bared in a sneer. "You think Hayes going to save you?" she hissed. "They look at you like you're special, but you're not. You're a souvenir." Liselot did not reply. She only felt the truth of it pressing down, the invisible boundaries separating her from James, from normal human affection. Even with these pressures, moments of connection persisted. Riding in the early mornings under skies that seemed impossibly wide, Liselot clung to James's waist as they guided the horses across the plains. The wind cut across her face, the scent of earth and animal filling her lungs. In those moments, the war seemed distant, abstract. In the rhythm of hooves against soil, in the shared labor and silence, she glimpsed life as it could be: unpredictable, challenging, and deeply alive. Every day brought small victories. She learned to saddle a horse, to hold reins with confidence, to anticipate the movements of an animal many times her size. Each success, each new word, each quiet smile exchanged with James became a lifeline. She began to understand that freedom could be subtle, that power was sometimes measured not in weapons or victories, but in patience, observation, and care. By the end of the month, Liselot was transformed in ways she could not yet articulate. The girl who arrived fearful and skeptical had become a participant in life, not merely a witness. Her German mind, trained in obedience and suspicion, found new muscles of trust and understanding. The Texas plains, the horses, the people, they were slowly teaching her a language of the heart as much as the tongue, and yet the shadows of war were never fully gone. Letters arrived, inspections reminded her of her status, and the constant hum of propaganda warned that nothing was permanent, nothing safe. The world outside Camp Darnell remained broken, chaotic, dangerous, but within the camp, within these quiet routines, Liselot glimpsed another possibility, a life in which fear did not dominate, where curiosity, connection, and courage could thrive. By the time October approached, Liselot was no longer merely surviving. She was learning, observing, laughing quietly in the evenings, writing, speaking, and dreaming in 2 languages. Every day was a lesson in resilience, a testament to the strange contradictions of war and humanity. The Americans she had been taught to fear had shown her unexpected kindness. The world she had imagined as uniform and hostile was in parts generous and forgiving. And in that tension between expectation and reality, Liselot began to discover something she had not dared imagine before: hope. As October settled over Camp Darnell, the mornings carried a crispness that cut through the dust and sweat of the Texas plains. Liselot awoke with a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The camp had grown familiar, the barracks, the stables, the dusty paths leading to the fence lines. But James Callahan remained an enigma, a figure at once ordinary and profoundly compelling. Their exchanges, sparse yet meaningful, had begun to form an invisible tether between them. Each day at the stables was a negotiation of trust, language, and respect, and Liselot found herself carefully measuring each step, each gesture, each word. It Was during one of these morning chores that the first real moment of connection occurred. James stood in the stable. Sunlight streaming through the gaps in the wooden walls, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The mayor, a chestnut mare with a temperament as fiery as the Texas sun, refused to follow the usual routine. Liselot approached cautiously, hands clasped. Around the brush, heart hammering as though it might betray her calm exterior. James didn't speak immediately. He observed silently, allowing her space, while subtly guiding the mare with his presence. "A lone step closer," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate. Liselot obeyed, feeling the warmth radiating from his body, the quiet confidence that made horses obey him. It was not authority born of fear, it was mastery born of understanding. She followed his instructions, her movements tentative. At first, then more assured, when the mare finally relaxed under their combined touch. Liselot allowed herself a small smile. James glanced at her eyes, flickering with something unspoken, a recognition that went beyond words. That brief acknowledgement sent a thrill through her chest, one she didn't entirely understand, but did not try to name. Over the next few days, their interactions became a rhythm, a subtle dance of shared labor and mutual observation. James would demonstrate, Liselot would imitate. And slowly they developed a silent communication. Words were limited, but gestures spoke volumes. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder to steady. A faltering step, a nod of approval when a task was completed correctly. A glance that lingered, just a heartbeat longer than necessary. All of it built an unspoken intimacy. The fences, the horses, the stables, they became their shared language. A world apart from the rules and regulations that sought to keep them apart. Language lessons in the evenings complemented these physical lessons. Liselot eagerly attended Miss Turner's classes, absorbing new words with the same fervor she applied to her work in the stables. She practiced English aloud, sometimes stumbling, sometimes laughing at the sound of her own mistakes. James began to integrate these lessons into their interactions, pointing at objects and repeating words, waiting for her response. Chair Zan, fence Zan. Each attempt, each correction was gentle and deliberate, a teaching without condescension, a patience that Liselot cherished. In these moments she felt seen, recognized for more than her uniform, her nationality, or her status as a prisoner. One afternoon, as they repaired a broken fence along the far pasture, Liselot's hands slipped on the post driver, sending a sharp pain shooting through her thumb. She hissed, biting back a cry, and James was immediately at her side. "You all right?" he asked, his tone threaded with concern. Liselot instinctively pulled back, wary of breaking rules, of inviting trouble. His face shifted, cautious, yet unjudging, as though he understood the delicate line between care and overstepping boundaries. "Sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean." "It's okay," Liselot whispered, shaking her head. "No blood, no real injury. Just the sting of error and the weight of vigilance." James gave a soft laugh, sitting down in the dirt beside her. They shared the silence, the kind that didn't demand words, but offered comfort. The sun climbed higher, pressing down like a warm reminder of the world outside her fears. In that quiet, Liselot realized that connection could exist even within boundaries, that trust could grow without declarations or promises. The first real conversation between them came not from necessity, but from curiosity. After a morning spent fixing fence lines, James asked, "Do you miss home?" The question was simple, yet it carried weight, a recognition of her humanity. Liselot hesitated, fingers tracing the grain of the wood post. "Yes," she said finally, voice soft. "I miss smells, bread, coffee, soap from my mother's closet. I miss noise, church bells, even sirens." James nodded thoughtfully. "I miss snow," he said quietly, and for a moment they shared an understanding beyond words. Liselot looked at him, surprised. Texas did have snow, though rarely, and certainly not like the winters she remembered from Bavaria. Yet the admission bridged their worlds, a gentle acknowledgement that longing was universal. Their hands, once so focused on labor, now seemed capable of holding invisible threads of memory, of home, of connection, small, seemingly insignificant. Moments continued to build their bond. James pointed out a cluster of wildflowers along the fence line, bluebonnets, The state flower and Liselot marveled at their delicate beauty. Pretty, she said simply. You should see them on horseback, he replied casually. The image lodged in her chest, stirring imagination and yearning for a world beyond the camp fences. These brief exchanges were the first signs that friendship, trust, and perhaps something deeper were beginning to root themselves between them. The camp was not without danger, however. Rumors of fraternization reached the ears of the guards, and Liselot became acutely aware of the watchful eyes that followed her every move. One morning a corporal lingered near the stable, his gaze sharp and calculating. Later in the laundry room, a fellow prisoner named Hera confronted her, dark hair shadowing her face. You think he's going to save you, she hissed. They look at you like you're special, but you're not. You're a souvenir. Liselot listened, understanding the caution, but refusing to internalize the bitterness. She knew that her bond with James existed in a space beyond envy, beyond fear, a space built on mutual respect and shared experience. By late October, the rhythm of their connection had solidified. Working side by side in the stables, repairing fences, learning English, and riding the horses, Liselot and James had created a private world within the camp. Their communication was subtle glances, brief touches, shared laughter, but it was unmistakable to both of them. In a place governed by rules, inspections, and propaganda, they had carved out a sanctuary of trust where identity, kindness, and humanity could flourish. Evenings were the most transformative. Liselot would retreat to her bunk after chores, rereading English poems, practicing words, and replaying moments from the day. Each interaction with James, each lesson learned, each small triumph with a horse or a post driver became a thread in the tapestry of her evolving life. She began to understand that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, it was the ability to feel, to connect, to trust in small increments. By the end of Act 3, Liselot had crossed a subtle threshold. The girl who arrived wary, fearful, and skeptical was beginning to understand that human connection could survive even in the harshest conditions. The invisible barriers of nationality, war, and policy had not vanished, but they had been softened by patience, empathy, and courage. Liselot's bond with James was no longer tentative. It was a quiet, resilient force, a reminder that even in a world designed to separate, friendship and perhaps love could take root. By late October, the leaves around Camp Darnell had begun to turn a muted gold, rustling softly in the Texan wind, as if whispering secrets to anyone who would listen. For Liselot, the days had developed a rhythm: morning chores in the stables, afternoon work on fence lines, and evenings spent in Miss Turner's classroom learning English and exploring new ways to understand a world she had been taught to fear. But beneath the routine, a subtle tension simmered. James Callahan's presence, once a comforting constant, had begun to carry a weight. Liselot couldn't entirely articulate it. Started with small things, the way he would glance her way a second too long, the unspoken acknowledgement when she succeeded in a task, the quiet patience he displayed as she struggled with a stubborn mare or a twisted wire fence. Each act, each gesture was innocent in isolation, but together they formed a current Liselot could neither ignore nor fully control. She became acutely aware of her own heartbeat when he approached, the way her hands trembled slightly when their fingers brushed while passing tools. Even the air between them seemed charged, every shared glance a tiny rebellion against the camp's rules. Camp administration had been clear: fraternization with civilians was strictly forbidden. Any emotional or physical involvement could result in solitary confinement, revocation of privileges, or even immediate transfer. The rules were cold and personal, yet they hung over Liselot and James like a shadow. Every touch, every shared smile, every moment of proximity was a risk, but the alternative, she realized, was to ignore the only connection that had softened the fear and loneliness. The war had left in her chest one morning as the wind kicked up loose hay and dust across the paddock. James approached with a saddle slung over his shoulder. The mare, restless in the heat, pawed at the ground. Liselot watched him work, noting the way his hands were both firm and gentle, coaxing the animal into calm. "Need help?" she asked, stepping closer than usual. He paused, evaluating her with a careful gaze. "Are you sure?" he asked, the subtext clear. Even proximity was dangerous. Liselot nodded. "I trust you." The words surprised her as much as they did him, carrying more weight than either intended. Together they secured the saddle, working in synchronized silence. The air seemed to hum around them, filled with anticipation. Neither could name the first real acknowledgement of their feelings came during a rare, quiet moment in the barn. Rain had begun to fall outside, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the roof in relentless sheets. They had finished cleaning the tack and were wiping down saddles, the smell of wet wood and leather filling the space. Liselot's hands lingered on the brush, her pulse quickening. James glanced up, meeting her eyes in a way that made the world shrink to the space between them. "Shouldn't," he began, but trailed off, unable to complete the warning. Liselot stepped closer, her braid brushing his shoulder. "I know," she whispered, "but I can't stop feeling it for." A long moment's silence ruled. The barn's shadows wrapped around them, cocooning them from the outside world. And then, with a tentative boldness, James leaned forward. Their lips met, not with passion or urgency, but with careful, fragile curiosity, as if testing whether the connection could survive the reality of their circumstances. It was a kiss of acknowledgement, of recognition, of shared humanity, and Liselot felt a wave of emotion crash through her: relief, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. After the kiss they pulled back, breathless, but aware of the consequences. "We can't," James said softly, though the words were more a statement of fact than a plea. Liselot nodded, understanding, but also realizing that their bond had shifted irreversibly. It was no longer merely friendship, it was something deeper, something the camp's regulations could not erase. The following days were a careful balancing act. They continued to work together, exchanging glances, subtle touches, and quiet words, always conscious of the watchful eyes of guards and fellow prisoners. The tension between them was a living thing, growing in strength and complexity. Every shared smile, every inadvertent brush of hands, every small conversation in English or German reinforced the invisible thread connecting them. Liselot's English lessons became intertwined with her moments in the stables. James began learning German phrases, attempting the sounds with a mixture of concentration and humor. Their exchanges were often clumsy, filled with mistakes and laughter, yet each misstep built trust. Language was no longer a tool of instruction, it was a bridge between two worlds, a way to communicate feelings that words alone could not fully capture. But the camp remained a constant reminder of reality. One afternoon, Liselot overheard guards discussing fraternization rules and recent reports of suspicious behavior. Her stomach tightened. The knowledge that they were being watched added a layer of tension to every interaction. Even casual glances became laden with significance. Every word weighed against the possibility of punishment, yet the danger only seemed to deepen the connection between them, making every stolen moment feel both precious and defiant. Late one evening, after a particularly exhausting day repairing fences, Liselot and James found themselves sitting on the edge of a small corral, watching the sunset paint the plains in shades of gold and crimson. The quiet between them was comfortable, intimate, and fraught with unspoken words. Liselot spoke first in a soft whisper. "Do you think it will ever end?" James looked at her, the fading light catching the edges of his face. "The war?" he asked. "I don't know. But this," he gestured subtly between them, his hand hovering in the space where their fingers had brushed countless times. "This doesn't have to end." Liselot's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and fear. She wanted to believe him, to trust that the fragile connection they had built could survive the boundaries imposed by the camp. And in that moment, they did not speak of consequences, of repatriation, of rules. They simply existed in the quiet, allowing themselves a brief reprieve from the world outside. The stormy weather of late October seemed almost symbolic of their feelings, powerful, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Each storm that rolled over the plains brought them together, forcing moments of intimacy, shared vulnerability, and quiet courage. Their first kiss had opened a door they could not close, and every Subsequent interaction nudged them further along a path they both feared and longed to follow by the end of Act 4. Liselot had experienced the full complexity of Forbidden's feelings. She felt the thrill of connection, the weight of danger, and the intoxicating certainty that even within the constraints of a prisoner of war camp love, or something profoundly like it could exist, the rules of the camp remained unyielding and watchful. But for the first time, she realized that some things, trust, care, understanding, could transcend even the most rigid boundaries. By early November, the Texas plains had begun their slow descent into winter. The once brilliant golds and reds of the prairie grasses had dulled, curling under frost and cold winds. The air carried a crisp bite, and the stables once bustling with the warm smells of hay and horses now felt sharper, colder. Liselot moved through her routine with a quiet, measured determination. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of chores and lessons, an undercurrent of anxiety gnawed at her. The first indication of a shift came in the form of a small brown envelope handed to her during lunch. There was no return address, only a familiar handwriting that made her chest constrict. Her mother's script, shaky yet unmistakable, spoke of a life interrupted by war, of losses and survival of a world Liselot could scarcely imagine in the ordered safety of Camp Darnell. She tucked the envelope into her waistband and tried to eat, but the food had lost all flavor. Each bite felt like chewing through fog, and she found herself staring across the mess hall, barely noticing the chatter around her. The envelope weighed heavily against her hip, a physical reminder of the life she had left behind and the distance she had crossed both physically and emotionally. That evening, after work and dinner, she retreated to the far fence line, the same spot she had often sought when the world became too loud or too empty. The moon hung high and full, casting long shadows across the ground. She sat cross-legged, hands trembling slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges creased from the journey across continents. Her mother's words flowed across the page. The city of Munich had been bombed, her father killed, her home destroyed, and her younger brother Jakob missing. The words hit her like a physical blow. She could not cry, could not scream. She only sat frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. Around her, the coyote calls echoed across the plains, ghostly and indifferent. For the first time since arriving in Texas, the war felt close, not as an abstract danger, but as a personal wound. Her family, the life she had known, had been irreversibly altered, and yet she was here in a place that felt both alien and strangely safe. James approached quietly, his presence familiar yet careful, as if stepping too close might shatter the fragile equilibrium. "You okay?" he asked, voice low and measured. She did not answer immediately, only nodded, still staring at the envelope. He did not press, did not ask for details. He simply sat nearby, the silence between them protective rather than oppressive. After a long pause, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "I know I'm not supposed to give this to you," he said, handing it to her, "but I didn't know what else to do." It was a simple note, 3 words handwritten, clear in their simplicity. "You're not alone." Liselot's chest tightened. Recognition, pure, unassuming recognition, was rarer than she could have imagined. It didn't erase the loss, didn't mitigate the fear, but it offered a tether, a connection to someone who acknowledged her humanity without judgment. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to weep, not for the war, not solely for her family, but for the profound, quiet relief of being seen, of being understood. The letter, combined with James' note, sparked a shift in Liselot. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her emotions began to show cracks in the stable. Her movements became more measured, more aware of him, not in fear, but in a cautious curiosity. She noticed the small things, the way his eyes caught the light when he looked at the horses, the callous strength of his hands, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Every detail felt magnified, imbued with significance she had not permitted herself to feel before. Yet with this emotional opening came a new layer of danger. The camp rules were relentless, and fraternization was strictly prohibited. Rumors of increased inspections and the ever-watchful eyes of guards reminded her that any misstep could carry consequences. Every glance exchanged with James, every accidental touch carried weight. But Liselot found herself unable and unwilling to ignore the connection that had grown between them. It was a risk she was now willing to take. The coming days were a careful dance of subtlety and restraint. They worked together on fence lines, repaired stalls, and managed the horses, all while navigating the unspoken rules imposed by the camp. Their communication relied on a mix of English and German gestures and shared glances. Words once so central to understanding became secondary. The silence between them carried meaning, a language of recognition, trust, and tentative affection. One afternoon, as they mended a particularly stubborn corner of the fence, Liselot's thumb caught the wire, sending a jolt of pain up her arm. James was immediately at her side, concern etched across his face. "You all right?" he asked. She waved him off, but he stayed, hands hovering near hers, ready to assist without overstepping. In that moment she realized the depth of care that existed between them. Gentle, unspoken, yet undeniable evenings became a refuge for learning as well. Miss Turner's English lessons took on a new resonance, each word and phrase a potential bridge between worlds. Liselot practiced quietly, reciting poems and sentences to herself, imagining their meanings in both English and German language. She discovered was more than communication. It was a means of connection, a way to translate feelings when the heart could not speak directly. The emotional shift was not without its shadows, grief for her family and the losses. Back home lingered a persistent ache beneath the surface. Letters from other prisoners arrived sporadically, each one a reminder of lives disrupted, of loved ones left behind. Yet the letters also carried the potential for hope, for reconciliation with a world that had seemed impossibly cruel. Liselot learned to balance the weight of sorrow with the small bright moments of recognition and human connection, most notably the fragile bond with James. By late November, the bond between Liselot and James had solidified into a quiet understanding. They did not speak of love in grand declarations, but in the measured rhythms of work, in small gestures, and in the silent acknowledgement of shared experience. Their connection was a lifeline, a reminder that even in a world structured by war and fear, humanity could endure. The letters both received and exchanged became symbols of this endurance. Each word carried a weight beyond its meaning, a bridge across continents and between hearts. Liselot discovered that the act of reading, of absorbing the experiences of those she loved, was in itself an exercise in resilience. And as she read and held each piece of correspondence close, she felt herself becoming more fully alive, more aware of the possibilities beyond the boundaries of the camp. By the end of Act 5, Liselot had undergone a profound emotional transformation. She had confronted grief, recognized the fragility and beauty of human connection, and navigated the dangerous terrain of forbidden feelings. The war and the camp had imposed rules, but they could not dictate the human heart. And in the quiet of Texas nights, with letters clutched to her chest and James nearby, Liselot began to understand that survival was not just a matter of enduring, it was a matter of feeling, connecting, and allowing oneself to hope. By December, the Texas plains had grown stark, the tall grasses brown and brittle, and the nights mercilessly cold. Camp Darnell itself seemed quieter in the winter months, the heat of summer replaced by a biting chill that made the wooden barracks groan in protest. Yet for Liselot, the chill of the air was nothing compared to the thrill and tension that pulsed beneath her calm exterior. The forbidden connection with James Callahan had grown into a careful rebellion, a subtle defiance against the rigid rules that sought to contain them. It began in the stables, as most things did. Each morning the two would arrive before the sun, their boots crunching on frost-laden dirt. The horses stirred in their stalls, breathing steam into the cold air, their muscles flexing beneath warm winter coats. Liselot and James worked in silence, at first the rhythm of grooming and feeding grounding them. Words were sparse, every glance, every touch of a hand against a mane or saddle carried meaning. It was in these moments, the shared effort, the quiet intimacy of caring for another living being, that the world outside the fence seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them and the horses. They tended one morning. A storm approached the camp faster than expected the sky previously pale and washed with morning light, darkened in minutes to the bruised shade of slate. Liselot noticed the wind first tugging at her braid and sending loose straw spiraling into the air. James Chestnutmar, the mayor, twitched nervously in her stall. Without waiting for orders, he grabbed her reins and called to Liselot, "Storm's coming." Now she dropped the pitchfork boots, slipping slightly in the frost, and ran toward him. In one fluid motion she mounted the horse behind James, wrapping her arms around his waist. The leather of the saddle was slick from dew and frost, but the grip of his hands around the reins steadied them both. The wind whipped sideways into their faces, sharp and biting, as they galloped across the pasture, their horses' hooves pounding against frozen ground. The roar of the approaching storm drowned out all other sounds, leaving only adrenaline, fear, and an unspoken exhilaration. They found shelter in the old ranch barn, a half-forgotten building that smelled of hay, damp wood, and time itself. The first sheets of rain slammed against the roof with a deafening fury, and the barn shuddered under the impact. Inside, the cold was replaced by the warmth of shared proximity. Liselot and James stood soaked to the bone, their clothes clinging uncomfortably, and for a long moment neither spoke. Outside, the storm raged, but within the barn a fragile calm settled. James finally broke the silence, voice low, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come," he said. Liselot's hands gripped the leather of the saddle behind him. "You told me to," she replied simply. His eyes searched hers, the tension between duty and desire etched clearly across his face. They stood close, not touching, yet the space between them felt charged, almost electric. Then, as the thunder cracked again, closer this time, Liselot leaned in. She whispered, and tired of pretending. Kiss that followed was tentative, careful, a meeting of lips that acknowledged the danger, the desire, and the impossible beauty of their connection. It was not a rush of passion, but a delicate acknowledgement of something forbidden and real. When they parted, their foreheads almost touching, neither spoke. They simply breathed, listening to the storm, the horses' soft snorts, and the quiet affirmation of their shared presence. After the storm passed, they rode back toward the camp in silence. The world smelled of wet earth, horses, and pine, a sharp contrast to the sterile routines of the barracks and mess hall. Liselot felt the exhilaration of survival, of daring, mixed with a lingering fear of discovery. Every glance at the distant fences reminded them that the world outside the barn was not theirs to command yet. In that fleeting window of rebellion, the camp rules faded, and they were simply two people on horseback, free from the weight of uniforms and suspicion. Days that followed were a careful negotiation of risk. They continued their secret rides whenever the weather permitted, always vigilant, always aware of prying eyes in the stables. They communicated in whispers, in half-smiles, in subtle gestures that no one else could interpret. Liselot discovered a quiet strength within herself, a courage that was born not of defiance alone, but of trust, patience, and the thrill of connection. James, in turn, revealed layers of himself that the camp and the war had kept hidden. Tenderness, humor, and a fierce loyalty that extended beyond duty to compassion. Evenings became a blend of learning and clandestine interaction. Liselot continued her English lessons with Miss Turner, reciting poems and passages in soft, measured tones. James would sometimes join her in the barn, attempting German phrases he had painstakingly practiced. Their attempts at language full of mispronunciations and laughter became another form of rebellion, a way to bridge cultures, to connect hearts across the rigid barriers imposed by war and nationality. The emotional intensity of the rides was matched by the quiet reflection they shared afterward, sitting on a fence line or beside a stable fire. They spoke of home, of family, of fears they had never voiced to anyone else. Liselot found herself confiding fears of never seeing Jakob again, of losing the tenuous connection to her past. James shared memories of Kansas, of dust storms, of the loss of his younger brother to illness years earlier. In these moments, the camp, the rules, and even the war itself felt distant, almost irrelevant. Yet danger was never far. Guard suspicions were heightened, whispers of fraternization circulating in the barracks. Liselot learned to read the signs, the lingering gaze of a corporal, the sudden inspections of work assignments, the way her bunk was subtly searched. Each act of rebellion carried consequences, yet the desire to connect, to feel, and to assert humanity over regulation kept drawing her back to James, back to the horses, back to the thrill of fleeting freedom. The culmination of their rebellion came one late afternoon as the first frost of winter glittered across the fields. James approached with a challenge in his eyes, a mischievous grin forming despite the cold. "Last ride before sunset?" he asked. Liselot nodded, heart hammering. They mounted their horses, the mare and a chestnut filly, and galloped toward the horizon. The sky blazed with gold and crimson, the sun a low dying ember in the west. Wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of pine and frost. As they rode, Liselot realized the depth of what had grown between them. This was no longer mere curiosity, no longer simple rebellion. It was recognition, respect, and the tentative roots of something more profound. The world of Camp Darnell, its routines, rules, and restrictions, could not contain the quiet revolution that had taken place in the hearts of two people who had started as strangers, enemies even, and had become something neither could fully define, yet both deeply understood. By the time they returned, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp. They dismounted quietly, brushing frost from their clothes and horses. Neither spoke of what the ride meant, nor did they need to. The rebellion had been silent, its consequences subtle. But the connection, the shared thrill, and the whispered understanding were unmistakable. They had defied the rules, the watchful eyes of the camp, and even the war itself, if only for fleeting moments. Night fell over Camp Darnell. Liselot lay in her bunk, heart still racing from the ride. The barn smelled of horses, hay, and rain, a lingering reminder of their shared escape. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of more rides, more secret moments, and the fragile hope that even in a world governed by war and fear, human connection could endure. The war ended not with fanfare, but with quiet announcements that rippled across Camp Darnell. May 8, 1945, was Victory in Europe Day. The commanding officer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hostilities in Europe had ceased. The words hung heavy in the air, as if the camp itself held its breath. Around Liselot, other German prisoners reacted in small, private ways. Some cried silently, some stared ahead, numb with disbelief, some spoke to no one. She stood frozen, tray in hand, the world suddenly feeling both larger and smaller than she had ever imagined. Days that followed were a blur of notices, lists, and instructions. Repatriation processes began immediately. Trucks arrived, and the prisoners were sorted by region and language. Liselot's heart sank when she learned her departure was imminent. She had 30 days, maybe less, to leave the camp that had become a strange sanctuary, the stables where she had laughed, learned, and quietly fallen in love with the rhythm of cowboy life. The thought of leaving James Callahan, the Texas plains, the quiet rebellion of shared rides, filled her chest with a dull ache. James did not speak to her immediately. Days passed with stolen glances, brief nods, and unspoken words. When he finally approached her, it was on a crisp morning, the frost still lingering on the wooden fence posts. She was stacking tools by the stable wall, fingers numb from the cold. "You heard?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "There. Sending you back," he continued. "Yes," she said. A silence stretched between them, heavy with what could not be said. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small black and white photograph. It was him years earlier, astride a horse, younger and lighter, smiling in a way she had come to treasure. On the back, in messy handwriting, he had written a single sentence: "When the sky feels too big, remember Texas." Liselot pressed the photo to her chest, feeling the warmth of memory and the sting of impending separation. The day of departure arrived. Camp Darnell was quiet, the usual routines disrupted by trucks and guards. Organizing the prisoners for transport, Liselot packed carefully, folding letters she had written to her mother, to Jacob in case he was alive, and one folded and hidden deep in her suitcase, unsent, addressed to no one, but meant for the memory of this time. "You made me less afraid of the world." She didn't return to the stables, the thought of leaving James behind unspoken. And unacknowledged was unbearable. He found her near the outer gate, the horizon pale with morning light. There were no words that could encompass what had grown between them, the quiet moments, the stolen smiles, the forbidden rides, the shared language of touch and glances. He handed her a second photograph, this one slightly creased, of himself riding the mare across a wide Texas field. His eyes met hers, steady, full of recognition. "I'll remember," he said softly. She nodded. There were no promises, no fantasy, only the truth of memory and the courage to leave it intact. The truck arrived, wheels crunching on the frost-covered dirt. Liselot stepped aboard, the photo clutched in her hand, the letters hidden in her bag. She found a seat by the window and stared at the camp as it receded, the stables, the barns, the fence lines, and the endless Texas sky slipping away. Tears threatened but did not fall. Instead, her chest ached with a strange combination of grief and gratitude. She had been an enemy, a prisoner, and yet in this foreign land she had discovered kindness, freedom, and a glimpse of love. Her journey back to Europe was long and quiet. She passed through multiple camps and processing stations, each more crowded and chaotic than the last. The letter she had written to her mother and brother, she folded, carefully, imagining a world where Jakob might still be alive. She wondered what her life in Germany would hold after the devastation, the loss of her father, the ruins of Munich, and the absence of her little brother. Yet the memory of Texas, of the wide sky and the chestnut mare, carried her through the uncertainty. When she finally arrived in Munich, the city was a skeleton of its former self, buildings reduced to rubble, streets empty, filled only with the debris of war and the quiet despair of survivors. Her mother was alive, staying with cousins, but their home was gone. Jakob was nowhere to be found. Liselot stayed briefly, helping her mother navigate the ruins, but the city, once familiar, now felt alien. She realized that she did not belong here anymore, not fully. The girl who had whispered English words to horses, who had learned patience and trust in the stables of Texas, was not the same Liselot who had left Munich months before. In 1948, she filed paperwork through the International Refugee Organization and requested permanent residence in the United States. She chose not to return to Texas. The memory was too powerful, too alive, and too entwined with the past she could not reclaim. Instead, she settled in Livingston, Montana, a small town near the Yellowstone River. The wind there reminded her of Abilene's plains, only colder, more honest. She changed her name to Lily, cut her hair short, and stopped waiting for James, for war, for a home that no longer existed in Montana. She built a new life. She found work at the public library, immersing herself in stories and knowledge and quiet routines that grounded her. She married a kind, quiet schoolteacher, a man who never asked too many questions about the war. They had 2 sons, and she told them bedtime stories in German, a language she had preserved for memory and longing rather than for practicality. The photo James had given her remained carefully hidden in her favorite book between pages 117 and 118. The edges curled and fading with time. Years passed. Lily lived a full, good life, marked by work, family, and small joys. Yet the memory of Texas, the dust, the horses, the forbidden rides, and the man who had looked at her as if she were seen, never faded. It remained a quiet, sacred place in her heart, a lesson in kindness, freedom, and the courage to feel in a world that demanded caution. In her final years, when her granddaughter asked about the stories she had told of Camp Darnell, of the cowboy, and the kiss in the barn, she smiled gently. Some stories, she said, aren't meant to be believed. They're meant to be felt. Lily passed away in 2009 at the age of 87. Among her belongings, her children discovered a shoebox in her closet filled with letters, unsigned, unscented, bearing witness to the life she had lived, the love she had experienced, and the quiet defiance that had shaped her. One letter summed it all. They taught me to hate America, but America taught me how to be free. Even decades later, the echoes of Camp Darnell lingered in the corners of her memory. The horse's warm breath in the morning, the wide blue sky over Abilene, and the quiet presence of a man who had taught her that humanity could exist even in the most unlikely of places. The war had ended, but its lessons and the fragile beauty of human connection had endured.